What a wonderful introduction. I'm going to have to cut 10 minutes from my talk so we get out on time. It's wonderful to be home again. I had a wonderful graduate career here and the beginning of my academic life. And it's really wonderful to come back and to see some people and to see also the places where I used to hang out at, and how most of them are not there anymore. I didn't go by to the house that I lived in, and maybe I'll do that tomorrow morning before on my way to the airport. I do hope the weather holds out. I'm going back to Philadelphia, which you may know won the Super Bowl this year, and we're very proud of that. And the city is closed down tomorrow, so my classes are not going to be held, and that was the reason I was leaving early. And I was just saying that the transportation out of the airport seems to be non-existent, and so I'm not quite sure when I'll get home, but if the weather holds out, I will get home tomorrow. So I noticed, actually, it was just a question was asked. I thought this lecture was on the Book of the Dead, and somehow, magically, one of the images just went ahead. But let me go back. Let's hope I get this right. No, it's going ahead. Okay, it doesn't say the Book of the Dead. This is the thing that I always say about when people ask about, is the curse real in ancient Egypt? And I say, no, there aren't any curses in ancient Egypt. Just on the lecturers who talk about ancient Egypt. And so somehow, from my computer to my assistant's computer, the first part of this title, which is the other Book of the Dead, an essential item for the afterlife of the ancient Egyptian kings, got lost. So I apologize for that. So now I can move forward. There we go. Okay, throughout, if you can hear me, let me know. I'll move the microphone around. Throughout Egyptian history, pharaohs went to great lengths preparing their final resting places. And you've seen lots of examples of that here. In many ways, these structures represented a microcosm of and a metaphor for the eternal life that royalty hoped to enter. Over millennia, their tombs took many forms, but whatever the shapes and whatever their religious symbolism, these monuments were a repository for the necessities of the afterlife. And we can see a clear evolution already from the early dynastic period and prior to that. So I'm just going to run through a couple of slides. Oops. Okay. And these are early dynastic ones. So you go to one, the first one that we had, which the superstructure was we weren't able to reconstruct it. In this one at Abydos, we were. And move very quickly from early dynastic period into dynastic period, Dynasty 3 with the step pyramids, and where the superstructure is becoming extremely important. Move on to the 4th dynasty, and we can see the Great Pyramids. And then the ones at the, excuse me, the pyramids of Khafre and Khufu. Okay, hold that one for a moment. What is important about these, or at least what I showed you, was the superstructure. And all of these burial places had some kind of a superstructure, as well as below ground areas for burial and storage. And that's what they had in common. Soon, however, for safety's sake, against robbers, and there were lots of those, 11th dynasty builders began to cut out corridors and chambers deep into the rock cliffs over which they found a natural pyramid. And this they felt was not so obvious, but actually it was pretty much obvious. I always say if you want to hide gold, don't put a giant mountain on top of it. It's sort of like a sign that says this way to the gold. Well, not long after, there were architects of the 12th dynasty who used an outcropping in the desert at Abydos in the south, where my colleague Joe Wegner from Penn works. And there was another symbolic mountain. And you can see right here, this is called Anubis Mountain. And it was visualized that, that Anubis, the god of the underworld, or the who was there at the final judgment, actually sat atop this mountain. And from some of the things that my colleague found, there are actually cylinder seals with that image, and we actually even know the name. And you see the interior, and the interior also would serve as a funerary residence for the pharaoh Senwosret III, as well as represent a three-dimensional version of what is an underworld book called the Amduat, which means what is in the underworld. So this is a funerary text, not the Book of the Dead, but it's another one. So this was, according to my colleague, this was a three-dimensional version of what we would later see in actual texts. Most royalty of the 18th dynasty built their tombs, however, in Thebes, in the Valley of the Kings, because of a variety of reasons. First of all, its connection with Amun-Re, king of the gods in that area, its remote location in the rock cliffs on the West Bank, and again, the presence of a natural pyramid. Now, within these tombs were all the necessities the king would need for his journey to the afterlife, including his mummified remains. And you see here a few examples. Here's the pyramid of Khafre, and the burial chamber of another pyramid on the right. I'm sorry, I went totally backwards. Sorry for that. Okay, this is, now we're in the Valley of the Kings, which I just told you, I'm sorry. And the mountain, you can see in the upper left, that's the one that's supposed to be your mountain that symbolized the pyramid. Now, we're in the right order. It's my fault, so I apologize. So these are some of the things that were being protected and that were necessary for the afterlife. First of all, mummified remains of the kings. Here you see Tutankhamun and Ramses II. Also, they would include a variety of things like food, wine, and clothing. They'd also include weapons, jewelry, and amulets. And in some cases, modes of transportation, implements of writing and painting. And a host of other things, especially a coffin or a series of them, as you see in the lower right, with the group that Tutankhamun had. Becoming more elaborate as time progressed, these interments were supplied with increasing amounts of various provisions. Some came in actual size and form, and some were as three-dimensional models. And some of them were in two dimensions all the way on the right, when you see an opening of the mouth celebration, which are the first of them, actually, of Seti I. Other than Tutankhamen's, this is a very important piece, but it's in 2 dimensions, so you can have them in 2 dimensions, 3 dimensions, a variety of different ways. And there were reliefs, paintings, and texts, especially in the tombs of the New Kingdom and later, that provide more information on requisites for the royal afterlife. For example, there we go. Amenhotep II's oval room, and then Seti the first ceiling. So you get a wide array of different information, textually and art historically, on exactly how a king would achieve his goal of immortality with these aids and the specific methods that he might choose. And all of these things developed over time. Our knowledge of the many details, however, depends on the preservation of royal tombs and the preservation also of the contents. And unfortunately, most pharaonic burials have not survived intact, having been subject to many intrusions, some in ancient times, some dating closer to more contemporary periods. What you see here on the upper left is a tomb robbery papyrus, so that gives us all the information about how exactly these tombs were robbed. And in one case, the text says that we burrowed through into the burial, and we found the king and his wife sleeping on their side. We removed all of the wrappings and the jewelry and the gold, and then we took their bodies out and we burned them. So for that reason, we don't have a lot of the material. And on the right side, we have one of the earliest, quote, archaeologists, Belzoni, and fortunately he was a good artist, and he did at least record a lot of what he found, but a lot of that went into the marketplace as well. Now, despite the situation, a few of these tombs have retained a significant amount of material relating to the afterlife. And some information comes from the design of the tomb. Sometimes it comes from the decoration that you see on the tomb's walls and ceilings. And sometimes it's the architectural details that give us information. And all of this information can help Egyptologists understand more about ancient Egyptian funerary ideology. Even in the pre-dynastic period, if we go back now with this understanding, we see concerns about the afterlife were evident in the impressive early royal burials. So, for example, this is Tomb UJ at Abydos with its contents, and it's really quite incredible where you have this, the burial chamber, the area divided up into places where material would be put in for use in the afterlife for the king. And eventually, these were enlarged and embellished, and they began to have royal statuary and also then relief. And here in Joseph's complex, you see the statue on the bottom, you see the magnificent step pyramid above, and then in the relief, you see the Jubilee reliefs that are shown as well. Moving on into the age of the pyramids, we have Khafre on the left, and then Sahure at Abu Sir with the relief of fecundity figures. Now, we get to probably one of the most important parts of this development that I'm trying to trace. At the end of the 5th dynasty, the last king, whose name is Unis, and you see his pyramid here. Well, it looks like every other pyramid on the outside with the causeway and everything else that we've now expected to see, but it has something else. The burial chamber, the antechamber, and the passageway between them have walls covered with carved and painted hieroglyphic text, and they have stars adorning the ceilings. And this is the first time we see royal texts on the interior walls of pyramids. And this is a close-up to show you exactly what they look like. The language and sophisticated content suggests that the pyramid texts derive from pre-existing concepts and ideas that had developed over time and had probably become an oral ritual. It is an interesting thing to read these pyramid texts because the grammar isn't like anything that we've had before and not like anything that would come afterwards. So it is very important to learn a lot about them to figure out exactly when these ideas came into being. So if we move on into the 6th dynasty, we have the Pyramid of Teti, the Pyramid of Merenre, and these are versions of the pyramid texts that began to appear in all the pyramids of the later kings in the Old Kingdom and queens also of the Old Kingdom and slightly later. And eventually, private citizens begin to incorporate them into their own funerary texts. Now, these texts consisted of spells with allusions to numerous deities, but the god Re and Osiris were clearly the most important and most frequently referenced. Occasionally, the creators juxtaposed the name of Osiris. There we go. With the god Osiris with the name of the king. And that's what you see right here. The traditional translation has been the Osiris, Pharaoh so-and-so, although some people have suggested it may be the Osiris of Pharaoh so-and-so. Eventually, private citizens would also adopt this phrase for their own use in a funerary context, certainly by the time of the coffin texts a few generations later. And that's what you see here. Another expression that appears first in the pyramid text is called ma'acheru. It means true of voice. And also, this was associated with the name of the king when it first occurs in the pyramid texts. And you see the text right here. And this, the one on the left, reads, "This Pepi, who's a king of the 6th dynasty, may this Pepi be justified or true of voice." And the one on the right is a little bit longer. It refers to the same thing. It's may the Ka, or may the spirit of this king be judged true of voice before the god. Now, this statement seems to suggest at this early period that the deceased pharaoh attained this status after being judged, or the status he needed to attain so he would get into the afterlife. So this is early examples of the importance of the idea of judgment for at least the king and possibly others in order to enter the afterlife successfully. Now, in the court in which the king would appear, the god Osiris and later other deities as well served as the judge. And then in the late Old Kingdom, private citizens, like with everything else, began to accumulate this title as well. And on the left, you'll see an Old Kingdom example. And then on the right, one from one of the tombs I work in Saqqara. And this is a private person who claims to be true of voice, which means in the afterlife he's gone through the judgment and he is now in a good afterlife. By this time, the royal and private use of this term ma'acheru indicates that both kings and their subjects believed in a concept of judgment as part of their journey into the afterlife. And this closeness in time frame between what one class of society was doing and what another one indicates that it's probably less what we call democratization. It's not filtering down, but more of a commonality for certain concepts. Also at this point, it seems as if the boundaries between the two segments of society appear more fluid, and especially as the private funerary spells we now call the coffin text develop fully. Appearing first in the 6th dynasty, the coffin text, one of the largest collection of spells, about 1,200, focuses on preparing the non-royal deceased for a successful trip to the afterlife. It's sort of interesting because many of these texts then become the basis for some of the Book of the Dead spells that occur later and are even used by kings. So by the 18th dynasty, judgment for both royal and private individuals became even more explicit in the mortuary literature. One important type of this text is an assemblage of funerary spells or chapters that sometimes included illustrated vignettes, and the Egyptians referred to them as the Book of Going Forth in the Day. And in modern times, we often call it the Book of the Dead. There are several great examples that I saw today in your wonderful exhibit of artifacts relating to this topic. And in fact, one of the longer ones, one of the longer examples of a Book of the Dead you have also in this exhibit. And I think it's, if you haven't seen it, you really should see it. I took lots of pictures so I can show my students too. While the entire corpus included slightly less than 200 spells, no single version contained every one of them. But a papyrus can also include, here's some more examples. And these are also of the same text, showing you more examples and the quality of the art that can go into them, and also the amount of text and imagery that goes on in some cases, as you see in the middle one on the right, that it is pretty much equalized. This one is an odd one because it's, I think, the only one that I've ever found. And this is a Book of the Dead that has only one spell. And how can you imagine that's a big papyrus, but it only has one spell? And the person who wrote the book on this, I think, has the right idea. And the Egyptians very often had the idea that the part can represent the whole. And I think that's what's going on here. So yes, it only has one spell, but it actually represents the whole. And it's likely that it was a lot less expensive to have only one spell than 30 or 40. However, if you were wealthy and you wanted a big one, you could do like EUF here. This is in the Turin Museum. You see the length of that case? That's all one Book of the Dead, and it's over 20 feet long. And they're probably the only place in the world that has a space that could accommodate it. Now, although Egyptians seem to have considered papyrus the preferred medium for these spells, they also put them on different kinds of surfaces. For example, they did them on amulets. So here is a scarab, and this is actually a royal one coming in end of the 13th into the 17th dynasty, the second intermediate period. And so it's an interesting thing. It's an early one, and it is actually on a royal piece. But it can also occur on tomb walls. It can also occur on papyrus, and sometimes on talisman. And I like this particular image because the one on the left is actually a tomb wall, and on the upper part of it you see a jed amulet, which is associated with a particular figure, that amulet itself, and it's supposed to be put at the throat of the deceased. And then you have a papyrus, which shows the same thing, And then on the right, you see from Tutankhamun's tomb, that amulet in 3 dimensions, which has the same spell on it. So it depends on how you wanted to interpret the information as to how it might wind up in a tomb. Sometimes it appears on jewelry. Sometimes it appears on coffins. Sometimes it appears on figurines, and this is a famous one in our museum, really a beautiful piece. Her name is Maya, and it's a Shabti or a Ushabti figure, and it has a spell on there to make sure that the deceased will not have to do certain kinds of work in the afterlife. It can occur on chests, and it can occur on mummy wrappings. And these were mummy wrappings in the Penn Museum with spells that were translated by Brian Muse of the Oriental Institute. They can also be found on funerary shrouds. And this one is another one we pieced together from the Penn Museum. And on the very bottom, it has a Book of the Dead spell. Masks are another place that you're going to find them. So, in addition to papyrus texts for the private sector, they could also occur on metal, faience, fabric, ceramic, wood, and stone. And although some aspects of many of these funerary literature, the funerary spells, had appeared in one form or another in an earlier mortuary literature, so for example, the pyramid text or the coffin text. From the New Kingdom on, the Book of the Dead, or the Book of Going Forth in the Day, became an essential accessory for the afterlife, for those who could afford it. It helped ensure their chance for an eternal existence. In addition to its use in the New Kingdom, this collection of funerary texts remained popular even in later periods. There are examples written specifically on papyrus and seem to have been owned primarily by private citizens. So it's interesting, this point, that why do private people get to have them on papyri? Because thus far, not a single example of a royal Book of the Dead inscribed on papyrus has yet come to light. So why did I show you all these pictures that refer to royalty, and I'm talking about the Book of the Dead? Well, I think the Book of the Dead meant something else, perhaps, to royalty. Now, some writers suggest that the looting of royal tombs and the fragile nature of papyrus explain the absence of a royal example. However, there are a large number of surviving private papyri, Books of the Dead, and that implies that papyrus may not have been so fragile. In addition, both the tomb of Tutankhamun and the burials of the kings of the 21st and 22nd dynasty contained a large percentage of what originally was placed in the tombs and among the burial equipment. You see here 2 good examples. On the left is a view into Tutankhamun's antechamber, and you see it literally just full of material. And then on the right, the Tanis tombs in the Delta area. Now, even though these finds were a good representative sampling, the excavator found no royal Book of the Dead on papyrus. Some Egyptologists have concluded, therefore, that although Book of the Deads were very popular among private citizens, royalty from the tomb of the New Kingdom on did not use papyri examples. One Egyptologist, however, has suggested that Tutankhamun's tomb had wooden statuettes, the type of which occur in private tombs, that had a secret panel, and behind that was papyrus. Sounds like a good movie, but we don't have this in any of the royal tombs, although he suggests that maybe a few of the type that were found in Tutankhamun's might actually have originally have had papyrus. But so far, nobody's actually examined these to see if there's a fragment of papyrus. And Howard Carter was a good excavator, and he did not record that. Well, it's perhaps, I think, possible to interpret the data differently. Perhaps Book of the Dead spells do occur in royal contexts, but not on papyrus. They occur rather on stone, metal, faience, fabric, wood, and all types of other things, as well as on the walls of tombs. And this is exactly what we found with private people. Royalty may have hoped that this distribution would enhance the chance that these necessities would survive and be useful for the afterlife. Tutankhamun's tomb had more than 20 Book of the Dead spells on some form in his tomb, and some appear more than once. For example, on jewelry, amulets, and chests. Now, the one on the upper left actually has more than one on the back of the front door, and one on the side. And the amulet is another of these golden jed amulets, and the spell for placing that in the right part of the body is on that spell. And then there are more spells on the canopic chest of Tutankhamun that you see on the bottom. Each of the layers that took care of protecting the king are seen here: the coffins, the mask, and then the canopic coffinet that held the lungs, liver, stomach, and intestines of Tutankhamun. All have Book of the Dead spells on them. So, Book of the Dead spells for royalty did in fact exist, and nobody questions that. But the preparers avoided using papyrus as the surface for recording these spells, so popular among non-royal examples. Certainly the cost of producing these that I just showed you in Tutankhamun would far exceed what it would have cost for even a small papyrus or even a large papyrus. Now, the royal Book of the Dead, I think, the spells clearly first occur in the late Middle Kingdom, and they run through the 17th dynasty. And perhaps they are a result of changes in ideology, decorum, economics, and a variety of other things. And they appear on early royal objects, a good number of them, and also some private ones. And what you're looking at now are actually inscriptions. The top two are from one coffin, Queen Mentuhotep of the 13th dynasty, and also, and that's from Thebes, and the one on the right is from another queen, Kemenebu, from Dahshur, and that was also from her coffin. If we move just a little bit later in time, I already showed you the one that's above, but almost precisely at the same time, there is one that's produced for a private person, and his name was Neb-Ankh, and he served in the court of this particular king, whose name is Sobek-Emsal. And so it's interesting that he was allowed to have exactly the same thing as the king, but that may have been because of his position. And the text that's on here is spelled 30b of the Book of the Dead, and it's an important one. It relates to the judgment of the deceased, and it represents the earliest royal occurrence of this particular spell, and a clear indication of the importance of post-mortem judgment. So we've seen it in texts, how important it was, even from the pyramid text, and now we're seeing it in a form in the Book of the Dead. And it also shows us, because we've got them occurring in both private and royal contexts at the same time, that everybody wanted to have it. Now, in the 18th dynasty, several pharaohs also made use of Book of the Dead spells in their tombs. Tutmosis III, for example, had a funerary shroud with 19 Book of the Dead spells, including the critical spell 125, which is the actual judgment text. And it's the most widely used one. Now, his successor, Tutmosis IV, also included this text on his coffin, but just a small part of the text, but the important part was on it. What it was for was to ensure that the deceased would have a positive judgment and earn the right to enter into the afterlife. In Dynasty 19, in the tomb of Merneptah, there also was chapter 125. And later Ramesside pharaohs continued placing Book of the Dead spells in their tombs, and in some places even in temples. In dynasties 21 and 22, the contents of the burials of the rulers based in Tanis in the northern delta had spells on the many funerary items, but most important for us is another one that has to do with spell 30b. If you go through the literatures I did for this talk, I found another one of these scarabs that has a very similar spell, but so far it hasn't been identified because it does not exist in those spells of the Book of the Dead that we're familiar with. So among the spells frequently found in the Book of the Dead manuscripts, 125 and 30b occur on both papyrus and scarabs, and they were considered of great importance to private citizens and to some royalty as well, since they related directly to this judgment. Spell 30b focused on the heart, the center of wisdom and knowledge, and this is a very important point. It was instructed, that is, the amulet was instructed, and that meant the heart, not to hinder, to speak, or stand against the deceased. What the dead wanted was an attestation of a good name, a good career, and a proclamation of excellent virtues. The spell also requested the heart not to utter falsehoods. In order to proceed, all deceased individuals had to pass this critical step. Spell 125, which royalty also had on their funerary monuments and tomb equipment, focuses on the judgment of the deceased. Some as now, you can find this illustrated very well on some of the papyri that are in the exhibition that you have here, most notably in the Ryerson. It depicts the god Osiris seated before a scale with two pans, one for the heart of the newly deceased individual and the other for the goddess Ma'at. And those pans had to balance, and since the goddess Ma'at was also referred to as balance or justice or order or decorum, she stands by watching it. But you see in the scale pans, you have, on one side you have the heart of the deceased, and the other you have the feather of Ma'at, and this has to balance. It's an interesting question as to whether the heart, if it was filled with good things, would be heavy, or if it was filled with bad things, it would be heavy. Because whenever you see the scene, it is in balance, which means the deceased is going into the next life. So what happens if it doesn't balance? Well, over on the right-hand side, in red, there is this monstrous she-devourer who watches the event that is in front of her or nearby, and if it doesn't balance, she gobbles up the soul or the being of the deceased, and that individual has a second and final death. Obviously, he does not go into the afterlife. He or she does not go into the afterlife. The scarab spell 30b directs the heart to make only positive remarks on behalf of the deceased. Spell 125 is more complicated and detailed. It includes a section where the deceased speaks first before Osiris, and secondly, he'll go into an area where he speaks to deities, and then third, one in the Hall of Justice where he addresses both Osiris and other deities. In the first two, his declaration includes a long list of negative acts and negative behavior in which he did not participate. In the last, he addresses the gods directly, with many reasons for a positive judgment that he deserves. And certainly by the New Kingdom, both royalty and private citizens had similar needs for the afterlife, and both had access to this critical compilation of funerary spells. How they each decided to incorporate this material for the afterlife differs somewhat. Nevertheless, spells of the Book of Going Forth in the Day, whatever form it took, was believed by the Egyptians to be an essential aid in receiving a favorable judgment before Osiris and a good and never-ending afterlife. It was not inexpensive and was available only for those people who had the means. For example, a small Book of the Dead papyrus ran about 1 deben of silver, which was the equivalent of 3 asses in ancient Egypt. And I think that sounds like a pretty good deal to get into the afterlife. I hope that I answered some of the questions you might have about the Book of the Dead, but I'm here also tonight to answer any more questions that you might have. Thank you very much.